Have you started a new walking routine to kick off the new year, getting yourself active, getting yourself moving again, but you're finding that your walking is starting to bother your hips and low back? There are some things you can do to help support those areas, and that's exactly what we want to discuss with you on this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast. We're going to cue our introduction and then dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and today we are discussing this idea of what do you do if walking is starting to bother your hips and your back. Maybe you are really excited about getting moving again at the turn of the year. You are ready to kick off your fitness journey and you want to start walking more. And so you did, but you're finding that 2 weeks into this whole thing, your body's starting to say, this isn't happening. This isn't working for us. And specifically, your hips and low back are telling you, I don't know that we can do this long term. What do you do? That's exactly what we want to discuss with you today.
You're right, Charlie. This is such a common thing. We are so pumped that you're pumped about getting walking, and congrats if you have been doing that. But something that we notice a lot is that people start a walking routine or other, they start moving more, and they realize, this doesn't feel so good on my hips and low back. I don't know if I can continue doing this. And really the concept that we want to, really teach today is that when this happens, it is just a sign that your activity, or your walking in this case, is exceeding the strength of the parts that you're trying to use. And so one of the heavily used parts, or body parts, joints, muscles, that you use when you walk is your low back and your hips. And so if you're starting to have, some discomfort, tightness, pain, symptoms in your low back and your hips, likely the problem here is that you're doing more than the strength of those areas. And so when we think about it like that, then we can start talking about solutions here. But if you're listening to this, I commend you because you're here to solve problems rather than to jump off the horse of exercise, because this comes up in everyone's exercise journey. Even Charlie and I, we've been exercising for years and years and years, and aches and pains are going to come up. And the solution here is not to take month-long breaks or do less and less and less. It's actually to troubleshoot and to figure out how can we make this work. Obviously, what doesn't work is to be building up your cardio, building up your movement, building up your exercise, and then it's breaking down your joints and muscles. We don't want that to happen. So we're going to be talking about how can you start addressing this issue that you are maybe experiencing because you've started to increase your walking, you're increasing your activity, which we all know we probably all need to do, but you're starting to notice it's kind of breaking down or not feeling so great on certain areas.
Absolutely. So one of the primary things that we need to discuss are what are some of the motions involved with walking, specifically with the hips and specifically with the trunk. Now, this isn't to say that what you're experiencing in your hips and trunk couldn't be stemming from your feet or couldn't be stemming from something with your knee. But for the sake of brevity, we're going to focus on what might be going on with the hips and what might be going on with the trunk, and some really simple things that you can do to try to help improve those different things. All right. So again, when we're thinking about the motion of walking and what's happening with the hips and what's happening with the trunk, one of the first things that we notice with the hips is kind of this forward and back leg motion, the leg coming forward and the leg coming back, all right? And so this is what we might call like hip flexion and hip extension, all right? That's one of the first things that we'll notice with the hip. With the trunk, it is a little bit more hidden almost, where it's not that your trunk isn't moving, but usually the motion isn't as noticeable, okay? And so one of the primary motions that's actually happening through the trunk when you are doing your walking is what's called trunk rotation, or this twisting or turning. Now, when you're walking down the street or walking on the treadmill, it's not like you're gonna visually see yourself turning from one side to the next, like you are, say, swinging a golf club, all right? In that instance, like it's way more obvious that you're turning your trunk. But at a much less degree, or to a much less degree, the trunk rotation motion is still happening throughout the trunk. And the problem is when that motion is not able to happen efficiently, other areas can start to get stressed out. Your body can start to compensate and you can start to experience symptoms. So when it comes to, again, the walking motion, there are a lot of motions involved. Again, for the sake of brevity, we're just going to, focus on a couple different ones today and some things you can do. But we're also going to focus on some things that, even though they're simple to do, they're likely things that you aren't doing. And so because of that, there is a great potential for upside and great potential to, have a big impact on what you're experiencing and your walking overall.
That's right. So as Charlie said, there's a lot of motions with walking. We're talking about two of them specifically, which is the motion of hip flexion. So if you think about like kicking your leg forward, that forward step, that's your hip flexion. And then trunk rotation, which again is kind of like a hidden motion. But if you study walking or what we call gait, the twisting motion is what happens in your core. Now, I had this really interesting experience happen. I guess it's not that interesting, but I think it's interesting. Anyways, so just a few months ago, I installed flooring in our bathroom here at the office. And we'll bring this back to exercise, don't worry. But I have installed flooring before, but I hadn't installed flooring for like a couple years. Like it's been a couple years since I installed flooring. And when you install like clip together floor for a bathroom, you do kind of the same motions over and over again, right? You go in, you measure out the floor, you figure out where you need to make the cuts, then you clip it in and make sure it's all fitting together. And then you measure the next one, you cut it, and after about like 7 cuts, my fingers started getting really raw from using the X-Acto knife thingy that I was using. And it wasn't because like the X-Acto knife or the cutting was the issue. It was because like I hadn't cut flooring in, 4 years. And now I just did it, 12 times in a row, and I still had the rest of the bathroom. And so when we add something new like that, and the reason it was bothering my fingers was because it was so new and I hadn't built up the calluses and all the, strength in my hands to do that exact type of cutting. That's what happens when we have like no exposure. And then I jumped into a weekend project where I had a whole bunch of exposure. That's what happens when we change our frequency of exercise sometimes. So a lot of us, we've walked before, right? But now it's the new year, or maybe you've just set out for a new walking goal, or, maybe nothing has changed at all. But now you're walking X amount of times and it's starting to bother your body. It's usually because there's this new and increased exposure. And walking is a type of thing that we call using your body. And so that means that we're going out and we're not really overly thinking about the muscles we're using. Usually we have music in, we're distracted. If you're lucky, you have a friend to talk to. You're not really thinking about the exercise, you're just doing it, right? And this is called using your body exercise. It's not a bad way to exercise, it's just the type of exercise it is. And so it can be really beneficial for a lot of things. But one of the things it's not very good at is building up the strength of your body. And so when we think about, hey, I just did probably a bunch of lounging and enjoying my holiday season or whatever you were doing before this season of extra walking, and now we've added this stimulus of walking, and maybe it's rubbing your hands like it was rubbing my hands with the cutting, because it's that new stimulus, and it's a lot of using, for example, hip flexion and trunk rotation that you hadn't been using at the frequency that now you're using. Maybe you're doing like a 10,000 step goal or a 5,000 step goal or walk 3 miles 5 times a day. That's a lot of usage of those areas. So the thing we're going to suggest and teach, and what we use all the time to solve this type of problem, is we need to build in some resiliency, some strength, some stamina into these areas. And today specifically, again, we're going to talk about 2 motions that highly impact walking, which is hip flexion and trunk rotation. So when you're having issues in your low back and your hips, and actually when you strengthen your low back and hips, these exercises we're going to talk about, it's very likely that you'll notice a change in knees and your feet, because we know everything's connected. In one podcast, we can't talk about every motion, but we know it's all connected. And so focusing on strengthening these areas is really going to help you as you increase the usage of these areas, which you're already doing with the extra walking.
Absolutely. So let's start with hip flexion, because I think that's the easier of the two for people to see, because it's the leg lifting motion, again, of the walking motion. And so we're familiar with that, but what we're often not familiar with is actually going and strengthening that motion and challenging that motion, because almost every single exercise that you're going to find at the gym for your legs targets something other than the motion of hip flexion. There'll be a lot of motions for hip extension, which is the the other direction, kind of bringing your leg behind you. For the glutes and everything like that, there will be exercises to bend and straighten your knees. There will be exercises to bring your legs out and together. But the exercises to lift your leg, unless you have access to a specialty machine, not too many people actually focus on doing those exercises, or if they do include some version of them, they normally think of them as like core exercises. So let's start with the hip flexion. Now, Julie, hip flexion is one that you really work with a lot with your clients, in particular, your female clients that are in their 50s and 60s, really helping them to strengthen their hip flexion. So what is one exercise that you do a lot with your clients to really help them target this area?
Yeah, so one that's really easy, you can do this one at home, is if you lay on your back and then bend one knee, and the leg that's not bent, the one that's out straight, you can slowly lift that one up and down. That's a great way to target the hip flexion, the hip flexors.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you're having your clients do this, like what things are they focusing on? What things are you focused on for them to help them, make sure that it's working their body in the way you're intending it to?
Yeah, great question. So all strength training exercises in our world always boils down to every exercise must match the 4 Exercise for Life principles. So I use the 4 Exercise for Life principles, and I'll talk you through how to do it if you're doing this hip flexion exercise. So remember, we're going to lay on our back, bend one knee, the other leg is straight, and basically the leg is going to go up and down. So the first thing is that we always want to stay in pain-free, symptom-free range of motion. So as you lift your leg, you're going to notice that your hamstrings will tighten. That is normal. Not anything wrong with that, nothing to stretch, nothing to release. That is normal behavior. Something in your body has to make your legs stop, otherwise our legs would spin around like they were like a clock. You know what I'm saying? Like they would just keep spinning, we wouldn't have a hip joint. Right, okay, so you're gonna lift and you're gonna be observing, is there pain, is there symptoms, is there tightness? And whenever you sense something like that, you want to avoid it. So if you feel it, then stop there and turn around and put your leg back down. And you're just going to slowly do reps like that, always staying in a pain-free, symptom-free range of motion. That doesn't mean work-free. So you might feel muscles squeezing. That is normal and fine. So the second Exercise for Life principles is controlling your moving and non-moving parts. This is a big one for this one because a lot of people like to launch their leg in the air, which then turns it into a hip and core motion. So remember, we're trying to really isolate this into a hip flexion motion. So what will happen is when you're laying on your back, briefly take a moment to observe like the relationship of your low back to the ground. So usually there's a slight space there, and that is normal. That is how our spines are shaped. And as you lift your leg, you want to keep your core very, very, very slightly engaged so that it doesn't get smashed to the ground. So if you are noticing as you lift your leg, your back also starts smushing down to the ground, you've just turned that exercise into a hip and core exercise. So we want to actually control the core, meaning don't move the core, and slowly move just the leg, which will allow that hip motion without the core motion. And you're going to notice when you start applying these Exercise for Life principles, you're like, but Julie and Charlie, I don't move as big as I would. That's okay. We're learning how to be specific, not how to be big, because the thing that changes our bodies is muscle squeezing, not necessarily large movement. Okay. Then Exercise for Life principle number 3, which is move slowly. You want to move slowly because if you're moving fast, you're going to miss all those signals of pain, tightness, all that stuff from principle number 1. And it is very hard to control those stable parts when you're moving too quickly. So that would then violate number 2. So always externally, you should be feeling like you're moving nice and slow. Almost like if I said, stop, you could stop in any motion and it wouldn't be 6 inches past where I yelled out, stop. And then the last principle that I'm always looking for is contracting and squeezing and trying to mentally engage with the muscles we're focused on. So that is the squeeze. Think about squeezing the muscles. So if you are laying on your back and you just kind of put your hand on the front of your hip, those are your hip flexors right at that crease, but the muscles that live in front of that crease, that's going to be your hip flexors. And so those are the 4 things that I'm looking for whenever we're doing any exercise, but in this specific example of a laying hip flexion exercise, again, just to recap, we are looking at, number 1, making sure it's pain, symptom-free motion, that we're moving, controlling the moving and non-moving parts, meaning we're moving your leg we're not moving your core. Number 3, we're going to move very slowly, so that way we can make sure that we are maintaining principle 1 and 2. And last one, we're going to focus on the muscle squeeze. So a lot of times we focus on other things like counting reps, talking to our friend, listening to the teacher, instead of really tuning into our bodies, focusing on the muscle squeeze.
Yeah, that's key. That focus on the muscle squeeze, this is going to be a really big one, especially if you're not used to really doing exercises specific for your hip flexors. Is going to be really easy to get distracted with what you might be feeling like with your abs, or just having the leg go up and down. But remember, we're trying to strengthen the hip flexors directly, and so one of the ways to make that more effective is to really focus on squeezing that group of muscles while you're doing this exercise. Now, the other motion that we discussed was trunk rotation, or the other motion that we brought up. And a lot of times with trunk rotation, there are different machines at the gyms, which I think are great options. But also a lot of times people try to strengthen their core in more or less like a neutral position, okay? And there's nothing wrong with strengthening your core in a neutral position, but we also need to progress away from neutral and actually strengthen our core through different positions of trunk rotation, using more motion than just kind of trying to keep our spine directly in neutral and not move, and doing just kind of like an isometric exercise in neutral. And so some ways you can think about doing that, in addition to using the different machines at the gym. I think there are a lot of great band options. So if you have a door anchor for your band and you hook it up at the height that's somewhere, say, between your belly button and the bottom of your sternum, that's kind of the height where the band is at. I think there are a lot of great options that you can do, just like standing, hanging onto the band, and twisting, and just practice that motion of trunk rotation, but focused on really squeezing through your trunk muscles, okay? So there are some things that you do need to watch out for when you're doing this. Number 1 is making sure that you are not moving through your hips at all. You want to keep your legs still, you want to keep your pelvis still, and you're just thinking about turning kind of your trunk on top of your pelvis. The other aspect that you want to watch out for is that you're not moving your arms at all, okay? So it shouldn't be like your trunk is straight and you're just pulling your arms across, okay? Keep your arms locked in place, keep your legs and kind of pelvis locked in place, and then think about twisting or turning directly, directly above your pelvis, all right? Your arms are going to be coming along for the ride, so they're going to be moving in space, but they're not moving independent of your trunk. That's one of the big things where I think people, I'm not going to call it a mistake, but they start to deviate from what may be the really more effective way to go about kind of targeting these muscles, is they start to, again, kind of lead with their arms or move their arms independent of their trunk. You want your arm and trunk to be moving as one, with your arms kind of locked relative to your trunk, and your trunk creating that motion. So, so you're still following the 4 Exercise for Life principles of making sure that the motion is done within a symptom-free, part of your range of motion. No pain, no pinching, no zinging, no stretching, nothing like that. You are controlling your moving and non-moving segments, which is what I just really kind of went over in greater detail, with making sure that your pelvis is staying still, making sure that your arms relative to your trunk are staying still. And then, again, moving slowly, which again is this idea of moving at a tempo or at a control, at a pace that you can control your moving and non-moving segments. And if you need to stop at a moment's notice, you can stop at a moment's notice. And then focusing on squeezing through your abs, through your obliques, through your core muscles. And even like a way to kind of initiate this and initiate that focus is think about bringing your belly button in towards your spine and then initiate the motion, okay? A lot of times if we think, oh, I'm going to think about turning, again, we can get focused on the arms creating the motion. Instead, if you think, okay, I'm going to pull my belly button in, that will start to engage those core muscles to begin with, and then kind of keep that engagement, keep that focus on that contraction, and then that can be a way to, again, keep your focus on squeezing your core muscles throughout the entire exercise.
Charlie, you bring up such a good point. I think one of the most difficult skills to teach someone, and the reason why I think many people never really truly train and strengthen their trunk rotation, is the ability to actually rotate your trunk. You'd be like, okay, I know you guys just said that twice. Charlie said it and then Julie said it, but I literally can turn all the time. I mean, I turn around in my car to help my kids, and I turn when I get my seatbelt on, and I turn, you're always turning. But the turning we're talking about is specifically in the trunk. So if you think about, like, we just had Halloween, right, a couple months ago. You guys have all seen skeletons, right? If you think about a skeleton, the spine is going to be right where you see that spinal column, right? That line. You're like, yes, Julie, we all know. But the spine has a thing attached to the top, and then there's like some open space and a thing attached to the bottom. So the top is like that rib cage and arms chunk, right? It's like that's like a unit. And then at the bottom, it's like your pelvis. And then your hips come off of that. The legs come off of that. So if we think about those two parts, let's just make it simple. The pelvis at the bottom and the rib cage at the top. So when you're truly twisting through your spine, you're going to notice that one stays still and one moves. Most of the time when we twist, we move both, right? So if I twisted, like if you were watching this on YouTube, if I twisted towards Charlie, I can twist and I just turned my pelvis towards him and I turned my rib cage towards him. But I could also say I'm going to keep my rib cage towards the screen or straight forward, and I'm just going to move the face of my pelvis. So that's actually a really difficult skill to teach. So it's cool to practice it, right? Like if you were just standing still or you're sitting in your car, you're just standing, I don't know, maybe you're in the middle of a workout, like make your feet nice and wide and then try to put your fingers on the front of your hip bones. Everyone knows where your hip bones are, right? Feel those. And then try to move the direction of your sternum or your rib cage without moving your hips. Try both ways. And then you can try it opposite. Like try to keep your rib cage still and then move the front face of your pelvis. So this is the skill we're talking about. That's like the big control your moving and non-moving parts on that one. And I just wanted to highlight this because here's the thing. If you hold a band and you start doing that very common trunk rotation exercise that most people do, most people are moving their rib cage and pelvis. Mostly because in exercise, we always think more motion is more better. And so the problem though is when you move your trunk, when you move the direction of your pelvis and your rib cage, you're actually not moving your trunk. You're not twisting through your trunk. You're twisting through, most of the time, is through your hips, your knees, and your feet, whether you do it that way, or your trunk doesn't move at all, and then you're just yanking through your arms, right? Like what Charlie explained, both of those. So the big key here, especially when we're training and trying to strengthen this trunk rotation, which is used with every single step when you walk, is that you have to be able to articulate that motion and strengthen through the rotation, not just externally, my body turned that way, and now externally, my body turned that way. It's like, well, what part moved to get you there? Was it just your arms punching the band out to the side? Or did you move your whole body and now your trunk is still neutral and everything moved from your knees down or your hips down? Or were you able to actually articulate that difference between I kept my pelvis still, but I'm moving my rib cage, and I kept my rib cage still and I'm moving my pelvis. On machines, you're going to notice there's pads, and I know no one uses the pads, but that's why they're there, is to actually to help check that motion, for you to help stabilize the motion of one or the other. I've seen both, where you move the upper body or where you move the lower body and keep the upper body still. So that's what the purpose of those pads are, if you do choose to get on a machine, is to help you stabilize one so that you are actually training trunk rotation.
Absolutely. Now, like we said, these are not the only motions that are involved in walking. There are a whole bunch of motions in the hips and in the trunk that are involved with walking, as well as knees, ankles, feet, okay? But if you can start by kind of building the strength and integrity of these two motions, that can go a long way to helping relieve, some of the stress that you may be experiencing with your hips and with your back if you're finding that walking is flaring up those two areas. The other thing that we want you to keep in mind is making sure that your muscles are contracting well to begin with. And that is where muscle activation techniques comes into play. And making sure that the muscles that you should be using with hip flexion, the muscles that you should be using with trunk rotation when you're doing your exercises and when you're doing your walking, that you're able to access those and that those are firing to begin with. MAT can help you do that. So then when you go and do your hip flexion exercises, when you do your trunk rotation exercises, now all of a sudden those exercises become a lot more effective because you are using the right muscles, because MAT has helped those muscles become viable options for you. So MAT is something that we practice at our studio, and it's a great integration, kind of preparing people's body for exercise as well as helping them to continue to exercise and get more from their exercise by, again, just making sure that the muscles that they're supposed to be using when they're exercising are able to be used.
Quickly on that, I just have a really quick story. So last week I went to Florida. You guys probably know this by now. I don't know if I bring this up, but you guys probably know this by now. My parents live in Florida. Whenever I go to Florida, especially when it's winter here in Chicagoland, I am outside walking all the time because I'm like, I need to be outside walking because it is 70 degrees here and it is currently -5 here in Chicago. So anyways, last week I did so much walking, and about halfway through the week, I started having some pretty intense symptoms. And then knowing what I know, I started doing my exercises and blah, blah, blah. And I was actually shocked that about, I don't know, maybe like 50% of my symptoms went away and I was feeling better. But the other 50% took me getting back on some MAT to address what was going on. Because sometimes our issues are from lack of conditioning. Like we just don't have strength in our hips and our trunk yet. Or, you know, there are other areas involved in walking, like your knees and your feet, that we didn't talk about today, but you get the gist. And sometimes there are areas that we're compensating around. Oftentimes when you have compensations in your body, it's very difficult to get them active all by yourself. They're almost like sleeping muscles. And so with MAT, we go in and we find the muscles that are sleeping, that need to be kind of jolted awake. It's very difficult to get it awake by yourself. But anyways, that will bring back strength to the system so that your body can stop overly protecting a certain area. So anyways, I just want to share that because that was just a story that I had just recently. And actually, it was from so much walking because I felt like I need to walk. I need to be outside. Why shouldn't I be walking on the beach every day and then walking around my parents' neighborhood every day? Because it's so beautiful. But sometimes even, you know, us that work in the field, we strengthen as much as we can. And then sometimes we just need that extra topping of muscle activation techniques to find out, well, what are we unable to activate ourselves, get that back in balance so that we can be exercising and feeling great at the same time.
So today we brought up how to use the 4 Exercise for Life principles for a couple motions that are really key with walking, with hip flexion as well as trunk rotation. But if you'd like our hands-on real-time guidance on implementing the 4 Exercise for Life principles within all the exercises and all the workouts that you do, it's exactly what we help you do within the Exercise for Life membership. And for a limited time, we're giving away a 30-day free trial to the entire membership. All you have to do to get started and get access to this 30-day free trial is go to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. Within the membership, you're going to find a bunch of different programs with a bunch of different workouts that will help you to strengthen your core, that will help you to strengthen your hips and throughout your entire body, including the motions of hip flexion and trunk rotation. But we are injecting the 4 Exercise for Life principles into every single aspect of it so you can make sure that the exercise continues to build your strength, build your health, build your function, and it's something that you're able to come back to long term. So again, to get started for free for the next 30 days, all you have to do is go to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that is really into walking right now, but they're starting to feel like, my body is not agreeing with this. This walking thing is not feeling the way I would hope it would for my body, my back, my hips is just not feeling great. Share this episode with them so they can learn about some things that they can start doing on their own to help strengthen their body and prepare their body for walking. And while you're online, head on over to your podcast platform of choice and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.